When the ocean turns violent, most people pray for land. But for a select few, the sound of a rising gale is a call to work. While the world's most seasoned sailors are losing their composure, these individuals are finding their pulse. When the instinct for self-preservation tells everyone else to run, they are the ones jumping into the teeth of the storm. Today, we go inside the world of search and rescue. Not in the calm shallows, but in the most notorious, freezing, and unforgiving corners of the deep.
The boat hit a big wave and the driver was launched out of the rib.
I'm talking with Tyler Brandt, Superintendent at the Canadian Coast Guard. A man who spent his career racing toward the emergencies everyone else was dying to escape. We're discussing the thin line between survival and tragedy, what you must know before you ever leave the shore.
We can respond and save lives, or respond and save the environment by getting ahead of environmental response.
This is Where the Ocean Meets Tyler Brandt.
Where the Ocean Meets.
Hi, Tyler. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today.
Good morning, Joel.
To literally jump right in, I'm a surfer, and I have this irrational fear that at some point I'm going to be one of those headlines of a person that's been pulled out to sea and miraculously rescued at some point. What is your tip for someone that's lost at sea? How should they behave?
Oh yeah, that's easy. You want to wear colored clothing, and you want to have some kind of communication and flotation. In surfing, generally that's a wetsuit, but some way of signaling. So yeah, we get like the kite surfers and then surfers and windsurfers, and the ones that get found are the ones that we can see.
Okay, so stay afloat, wave if you can see a helicopter, a boat, whatever, splash around, and don't waste your energy.
Yeah, and I think, one of the real big survival predictors, not just for surfers, but for anybody on the water, is flotation. And because people sort of equate being able to swim with being able to float. And a lot of the time, especially in cold water, your ability to acclimatize to the cold water and get yourself under control and protect your airway depends on how much reserve flotation you have, not necessarily your swimming skill.
Okay, that's interesting. So people should start, or those that play around in the ocean should learn how to float properly.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's good. But so we already learned something. Maybe you can give a bit of background of where in the world you are, because I think you're taking care of a very specific piece of the ocean that can be cold, harsh.
Yeah, I'm calling from Victoria, British Columbia, and I am the Superintendent of Search and Rescue for Canada's Canadian Coast Guard Western Region. So the Western region spans 27,000 kilometers worth of coastline, all the way from the sort of the U.S. border north of Seattle up to the Alaska border, and then actually our region goes all the way out to Manitoba. So we have a rescue vessel on Lake Winnipeg and into Manitoba. So it's a big region, and there's lots of aquatic activity. And the interesting thing about this part of Canada is it doesn't freeze in the winter, so we operate 365.
Oh wow! Okay, I saw that you're with the Coast Guard for quite a while already. I think almost an entire lifespan, basically, or a good amount of your life spent at the Coast Guard. And to keep people's interest up, maybe we start. What are the stories that kind of stuck with you over all these years? Do you have like the top three?
Oh gosh, how do you ask a sailor to tell stories? I mean, how many hours do you have? It's interesting. We just had an interesting call. Was it Saturday? Last Saturday, there was a Navy sailor that was two Navy sailors that were in a Rijal inflatable, doing some operations in fairly nasty weather. I think they probably underestimated the weather. And the boat hit a big wave, and the driver was launched out of the rib carrying the kill switch. And the new sailor didn't know how to reset the kill switch and wasn't able to find a spare kill switch. So it was dark and blowing about 60 or 70 kilometers, and they got separated. And so the search units all tasked out. We had a pilot boat and some Navy boats and search and rescue aircraft. And they managed to find this fellow swimming in his dry suit after 2 hours in the water, which is a pretty good survival time.
It's December that we record this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And there's multiple questions as follow-up for me from this. And one is maybe quite personal. We're speaking for the first time, basically, for anyone that's listening. We had a 2-minute intro. But one thing when I prepared for this conversation is, how do you explain to your family that you're basically putting your life at risk to save someone else who might have been not as careful as they should be?
Yeah, I don't explain that to my family anymore because I'm mostly an administrative role nowadays. Back a long time ago, I was out on the ships and driving rescue boats. But it's service to Canada, and it's also guarding the coast, and there's lots of aspects of guarding the coast. So we have new recruits that come in every year, and I teach different sections, risk assessment, a few other things to the new recruits. And I explain to them that guarding the coast is two aspects. There's the coast and the guard. And so part of the Coast Guard offers a safe place to navigate, where there's aids to navigation, vessel traffic services, traffic coordination, lighthouses, AIS tracking. So that's the preventative part. So you can trade a ship or sail your yacht safely and not necessarily get into trouble. So that's the coast part of it. And then the part that I spend most of my time in is the response part of it. And that's when things go wrong, we can respond and save lives, or respond and save the environment by getting ahead of environmental response and booing off oil and preventing pollution from getting into sensitive areas. So there's those two aspects of the service, and they're a lot of fun. Either aspect is a real adventure.
That I can imagine, because basically when we take that situation that you just described with the lost sailor, you get that call. There's a storm out, and you got to jump on a helicopter or on a boat and head out into that storm. Is there any adrenaline in these situations, or are you so trained that this has become routine? Is there something like routine?
There's always adrenaline. And I think, after a bunch of years of experience, you learn how to manage that adrenaline to the point where it doesn't throw off your decision making. And that just happens through experience and training. Sometimes people put too much reliance on experience, and they let up on the training, but you need to actually regularly drill to make sure that a lot of those actions and decisions are rote memory.
Okay, so you got to be prepared to make or to do a good job as search and rescue. Maybe I have a very romantic idea about the job of like a close team on a boat. Everything is working like a well-oiled engine. But I think over the years, there's also a lot of technological change that you have. And now you're overseeing this entire search and rescue. Maybe you can explain a little bit how the job has changed over the years, if at all.
Yeah, I think technology's really reduced the amount of search in search and rescue. So especially as we get into cell phones that have a greater coverage, or if even like a satellite coverage in our region, the 27,000 kilometers coastline, now a higher percentage of that coastline is in cell coverage. Now, Canada is a very rural place, so there's still a large percentage that coast that is not within cell coverage. But because cell coverage is getting more and more ubiquitous, the ability to pinpoint people using cell phones and radio direction finders, and also because people are carrying GPSs and they're often using electronic navigation, they have to know where they are. So that takes the search piece. And the search piece is actually a lot of the detective work that happens at the Joint Rescue Coordination Center. They're the ones that try and put the puzzle pieces together. I remember there was a case years ago where he was a young kid, and I think he stepped into a boat at a beach party, and the boat floated away, and he phoned 911 and rescue center, and he had no idea where he was, and that the rescue center coordinator managed to interview him and figure out through clues of this rock and these trees and this lighthouse to be able to pinpoint exactly where they were using that kind of detective work, and they found them. So that piece of the job is becoming rarer now, and now it's just getting on scene and getting help to people faster.
Mm. Do you feel like the kinds of incidents changed as well over time? People as uncareful as they've been in the past, or do you feel people are more educated when it comes to the ocean and the risks?
Overall, the yachting and recreational search and rescue has fallen about 10 or 15% over the last 5-6 years. But interestingly enough, the incidence of commercial shipping has gone up. And we're into a sort of a strange world where COVID prevented some of the shipping lanes or lines from replacing their ships. And then also we've got UK, Ukraine, and Russia shadow ships. So there's some more shady ships out there, and they're not necessarily well maintained, and we find that they're breaking down more often nowadays. So we're having ships that'll break down and drift sideways. So we have to get tugs and people on scene quicker. Otherwise, we can end up with a sort of ecological disaster.
Mm. So it's crazy. Basically, you're superintendent. You're overseeing a lot of these operations, and they span from somebody that gets on a boat drunk at a beach party to a shadow ship that shouldn't be there in the first place, losing control and drifting towards shore.
Yeah. So just yesterday, or day before yesterday, there was a tug and barge, and they was transiting, American tug and barge transiting through Canadian waters. The barge had a bunch of containers and some trucks and some sort of mixed cargo. And the tug took an unexpected swing. We're not exactly sure why or what caused it in the channel, and it scraped the barge along the side of the channel. And the barge actually took a bunch of big pine trees off the cliff. And so when a Coast Guard ship went by, they noticed there's these big trees sticking out of this barge, and the corner of the barge had been vented in and was leaking. And that's the second barge incident that we've had in a month. So there's a real big variety of things that can happen on the coast, and so they require different responses. And in that case, we work with the company who the American shipping company that was very motivated to make sure that the barge would sink and that there wasn't pollution. So sometimes we'll do a joint incident command team to handle those kind of situations so that they don't get worse. And then we get up to 3,000 search and rescue cases per year where we're trying to save lives. So it's a busy region, and there's lots going on. It's a fun job, and it's nice to be able to apply decision making skills and a little bit of detective work at all these different scenarios.
3,000. That's only like 9 cases a day. So 9 times a day somebody calls into search and rescue from a distress situation where it's then really serious, or do you also get these calls? You're like,
yeah, those are 3,000 real cases. That's not even a tenth of the actual calls we get. So, and this time of year, it's not 9 cases a day. In the summer, it can be 20 or 30 cases a day. So we have 2 rescue center coordinators on shift with some assistants in the background in the summer. And, they'll sometimes handle like over 1,000 calls in 24 hours. So it's, big workload in the summer.
Because everybody that's recreational is out there. As soon as the storm comes, you might have storm cases, but not the recreational ones. Interesting. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned you switched basically from being on a ship, being in the search and rescue yourself, into a more administrative role, and also, to my understanding, into a role of a communicator of things that need to improve to some degree. And the other driver besides technology that you mentioned in one of your papers is basically climate change. How does climate change interfere with your work, or what made it different?
Yeah, so climate change is a threat multiplier. And for us, I wrote a little paper called Black Swans and the Jet Stream. And again, I don't want to come across like a climatologist or a meteorologist. I'm certainly neither one of those. I'm just a sailor that knows a little bit about meteorology. But as far as I understand it, the Arctic is warming at a faster rate than the North Pacific weather systems. And so that gradient of being very cold and very up north, and then warming up to the continent, the gradient is what drives the jet stream. And so as you decrease the temperature difference or the gradient, the jet stream starts to slow down and it becomes more wavy, and we get more eddies in the jet stream. And so we had in 2021, we had this horrible heat dome and I think Europe had one last year, where if the jet stream's slowing down, then you end up with weather systems that get sort of stuck or slow, and they can create a lot more effect and damage. So we in 2021, we had the heat dome, and then we had an atmospheric river that caused all kinds of flooding. And so you end up with extreme wind, extreme temperature events. And the nautical world is engineered for all the extremes based on historical wind and tide and forces, from like the 20th century, not necessarily the angrier planet of the 21st century. And so what we're seeing horrendous, say 200-year storm force winds that are breaking ships' lines or pulling bollards out of wharfs, and overwhelming pleasure vessels, capsize, that kind of stuff. And that's new. And we end up with, we had one day in, I think, 2024, between Christmas and New Year's, it was Boxing Day, where we had 3 deep sea ships that were in a storm, and they were all broken down and drifting at the same time. And so it was a scramble to get tugs on each one of these ships before they hit the shore. So that's all new. And I think climate change is definitely an aggravator. There's all kinds of geopolitical forces that are causing some of these trends, but climate change is the top of my list as far as a threat multiplier.
And it's one of those threats where it's easy to feel powerless, where it's such a massive change and it's so unpredictable. And in one of your papers, you mentioned these 15 possible black swan events. And out of these 15, I think 11 happened. And maybe you can start with defining what a black swan event is for those that have never heard that term.
Yeah, we decided to do some all hazards threat assessments. And so that's an old sort of NATO technique to be able to, for a big agency or it's like say Shell or Chevron, to be able to say, let's make a list of 10 or 15 really bad things that could happen. Let's look at our planning for all those things. And if we see something that is likely and not planned for, then let's use a little bit of money this year to build up a plan or buy some equipment or do some training to be able to cover those bases. So I was part of a team in the Canadian Coast Guard where we actually did that all hazards threat assessment in 2018. And generally, a big agency like this will list a whole bunch of terrible things that could happen. And if you're unlucky, one or two of those things will occur. And if you've done some aggressive planning, then you'll be ready. And occasionally a black swan is one of those things that you hadn't necessarily anticipated, but catches you by surprise. And then you can, if you survive your black swan, then you can fill in your planning regime after. So in 2018, we went about and did this, and we listed a whole bunch of events that were sort of within our realm of nautical disaster issues or nautical incidents, threats. We came up with about 15 of them, and within 4 or 5 years, all 13 had happened. I think that it was just forget what didn't happen, but basically it was a wake-up call for us because of whatever the forces are that are going on that are changing things. It was a surprise to be able to say, all right, listen, we didn't anticipate a heat wave, we didn't anticipate a pandemic, we didn't anticipate sort of a war going on in Europe. All of these things were a surprise and were a breakout from the previous trend of 20, 30 years.
And what other black swan events were there? You mentioned the heat, the war. You have the geopolitics, obviously, that come with that. As an individual, a black swan event for me is being lost at sea, which is your day job, basically. What fears you?
One of the big threats that we identified that we hadn't dealt with, not since the 1970s, was a ship fire. And we looked at our planning structure, and there was definitely some holes in our policy and our capability and capacity for ship fires. And so I put together a planning team to work with the ports of Vancouver and Victoria and Transport Canada, and we were going to run a ship fire scenario. I think it was in November of 2021 that we planned it. But in October 2021, we had a big container ship called Zim Kingston come into our approaches and then wait for her berthing. And while she was waiting for her berthing, she got hit by a 13-meter wave set, which threw her on her beam, and she lost over 100 containers over the side. And so we got her to limp in and take an anchorage right off of the capital city here, Victoria. This is where I live, and I'm actually right on the waterfront, so outside my living room window, you can see this anchorage. And what had happened is one of the containers that got crunched while the other ones were rolling over the side was full of these hazardous mining materials. And these mining materials will spontaneously combust when exposed to water. And so we had this big atmospheric river come in and a huge deluge of rain. The rain got into this broken container and started a fire. So basically outside my living room window, there was a 1,000-foot container ship on fire at an anchorage at the capital city of British Columbia. And that was number one threat on our list. And we hadn't quite gotten around to doing the full plan yet. So that was a big day.
Take me through that day. You get that call. What comes next? Was that in your responsibility then?
Yes. Yeah. I hadn't been feeling well, and I was waiting on a COVID test. This is right in the middle of COVID days where everything's locked down and nobody's allowed to work. So when the ship originally lost its containers, they set up an emergency coordination center and then an incident command post. And I generally have a role at the incident command post, depending on what flavor of incident is. So I was waiting for a COVID test to come in, and I couldn't go into the incident command post until I'd actually got a COVID green card. So meanwhile, and this is where it connects into your plastic thing. I'm walking out my living room or my front door out to the ocean, and I'm taking pictures of this ship that's on fire, and thinking, "Gosh, I wish we had some real firefighting ships because the Coast Guard didn't have any." And I looked over, and behind me there was these two beautiful blue Maersk tender and Maersk trader that were here doing ocean cleanup, and they were out doing the North Pacific Gyre plastic cleanup, and they were also going up and down the coast collecting plastics. And they had 4 beautiful fire monitors on board. So instead of going to the incident command post, I walked up the gangway to the ship and said, "Hey, are you guys, could you guys possibly get away and fire up these fire monitors?" And they said, "Yeah, we're watching this fire and we could get away really quickly." So the ship owner, we managed to talk the ship owner into hiring these ships, and we got them away from the wall, and they were integral in cooling down those containers and keeping that fire contained for the fire team to arrive, because the firefighting teams for these kind of incidents are very specialized, and there's only basically these big salvage companies, mostly based in the US, some in Europe, but none in Canada. They have to fly in, and so you need to be able to buy time to get them on these scenes. So yeah, that was definitely a big Saturday in Victoria.
Incredible bad luck that all of this happened, right? It's like, what are the odds that a 13-meter rogue wave hits you, puts you on the beam, that you then have the wrong material loaded, you then have the weather event, which puts everything on fire, and then the incredible luck, plus all of that happened on your front porch, basically. And then the incredible luck that there's 2 boats sitting there that have the equipment that it sounds like it's not standard equipment that you have on a boat.
No. Yeah, it's those monitors were perfect too, because they were at the height that they could actually direct the water and the cooling down onto the containers, where when we would call out a smaller fireboat, it would have to shoot up and then do a big arc, and it wasn't a very effective cooling. So yeah, thank God for the Maersk tender and trader, and if those captains are listening, we owe you a lot. Those ships really made a big difference. And when it's in your living room, it ends up being a little bit closer to home.
Literally, yeah. That's crazy. And you mentioned then typically these firefighter crews, they fly in, but on which boats do they then operate? Or is it special equipment that they bring and they get on the boat? And
yeah, so an incident command team will be stood up, and generally it'll be like a Canadian federal incident commander, along with an owner and like a provincial incident folks. and they'll help coordinate these salvage teams. So the salvage teams will say fly in from Alaska or Seattle. And then that incident command team, like Coast Guard has ships and helicopters and trucks and that kind of stuff, but we don't necessarily specialize in that type of salvage. But we certainly specialize in giving people rides, so we can pick someone up from Port Townsend. We can work with our customs and border to make sure that they get through the customs quickly, and then transport them out to the scene, and then we can give them some horsepower and some folks. But we don't necessarily have that specialized salvage expertise, because it's quite rare that was used to be rare. Back in the 90s and the early 2000s, that these things happen, but it's becoming less and less rare.
I'm so fascinated by the breadth of cases that you have to cover and that you have to be prepared for. And then in the grand matter of things, the antidote is probably quite expensive for something where the likelihood of something happening is so incredibly low. Is this a big pain point for you, actually, to get budget for these kind of things? Or when you came up with the ideas like, hey, let's list all the threats that we have and come up with a plan on how to counter those, did people say, is like, that's a great idea? Or say, it's like, come on?
No, they basically, I did a presentation on it. They all smiled and nodded, and then moved on to like a PowerPoint about lighthouses. So there was no money and no resources. We had a fairly small planning team, so we picked one or two of the threats that were most relevant as far as our mandate. One of them, one of them is like mass rescue, cruise ship evacuation. And we put some exercise and some force generation efforts towards building up that. But all the other things on the list basically got left on the list. And but as we moved between 2018 and 2025, it was definitely a wake up call for the agency to be able to say, hey, a lot of these things are happening, and we might want to take some of them seriously, especially when they're a day job. And so ship fires and hazardous and noxious substances are in that category of, hey, we should probably actually have a better look at what is our readiness for major incidents in these categories. And so, we're working with it. We had some national funding for H&S training. We've got some sensors, so we'll be able to identify atmospheres that are no-go. And won't have to rely on green smoke and that kind of stuff, or wait till it's too late to get into those situations. So those are kind of new for us. And but the Coast Guard, the Canadian Coast Guard, just moved from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to the Department of National Defense.
Oh, wow.
And with that, I think
the bigger budget,
going to be a little bit more money. Yes, exactly. So now out comes Tyler's wish list, and hopefully we'll be able to tackle some of those.
I think from your track record, they should take whatever you put on the list seriously. And that makes me almost scared of my next question, because I don't want to jinx anything. But is there anything that where you think like, my God, I really hope this doesn't happen, because there's no plan in place? Or
yeah, my worst nightmare is a cruise ship incident, like the Costa Concordia or worse. You would have a recency bias, and so if you're a history buff, then you can go back 40, 50, say 80 years, and you get into some pretty horrendous nautical cases. The tradition at the sea over the last hundreds of years is that there's a lot of shipwrecks and a lot of death and a lot of suffering, just not necessarily from 1970 on. So that kind of cruise ship disaster is definitely one that keeps myself and the coordinators at Rescue Center Victoria and Rescue Center in Halifax up at night, because if you can imagine a cruise ship having to dump 5,000 people into lifeboats in austere conditions. That's a bit of a logistics challenge, to say the least.
I just know the security protocol from the airline industry that I think you have to be able to clear a plane within 90 seconds. And that's basically under lab conditions where everybody knows exactly what step they have to take. And I think this is how they cleared the A380 in the final test round. Is there anything similar in the shipping industry?
Yeah, there is. There are standards to exactly how long it takes for a lifeboat to load and a lifeboat to be able to launch and get away from the side of the ship. There has to be enough lifeboats on each side of the ship to take all the passengers. But if you can imagine, like, some of those lifeboats are like maybe the size of your living room, yet they have a number of, 100 passengers. If you can imagine 100 people stacked into your living room, that's a
good party, but not a good boat.
Yeah, exactly. Good party for about 15 minutes, and then it starts to get ugly, especially if it's wavy.
Yeah.
So, I think some cruise industries are take this issue very, very seriously, and they're willing to do some planning and work with the agencies. And some not so much, right? So it's a bit of the roll of the dice, but it's one of the issues we had, like in one of the papers I gave you, we talked about Queen of the North, which was a ferry that went down here in 2006. And one of the issues was accounting for passengers. So if you've got so many passengers that come off the ship, and then you've got a manifest of so many passengers having sailed on the ship, and you can't reconcile those numbers, then you end up in sort of this endless search without accountability. And plus, people just don't understand, what's happened to their loved ones. They're trying to figure out, where people are. Are people okay? So that can be a real logistics challenge too. So casualty tracking, also categorizing, triage categories of how badly people are injured and who has to go to the hospital first, which can be, if the ride to the hospital is 300 miles by helicopter, it ends up being a fairly important decision.
A very immediate question on that. I think most people saw the movie Titanic, and it was always women and children first. Is that still a thing?
No. Well, I'll tell you a funny story. When I was a young rescue crew or a rescue captain, there was a tug that was sinking, and it had hit a rock. And there was a family, husband and wife and 3 kids. And then there was another guy there too. And the tug was sinking, not rapidly, but it was definitely taking on water. So I came alongside and I said, did you want to get women and children off the boat while we handle this? And the mom turned around and said, well, I'm the captain. Says, these guys can leave first, and me and my daughter will figure this out, right? So you can take the men off. So generally that's not a thing anymore, women and children.
Okay. Where I wanted to actually follow the conversation was the way that I understand it now is basically, or the way that I understand your job is that you predict risks and then build out plans against it. Is that a generally rough or generally correct assumption? At least this is what I'm reading from your papers, that you're calling out the risks.
Yeah, that's been a part of a side role. So my job is the manager of the service. So I have a training team that travels up and down the coast, actually working with some of the small communities and training rescue teams, volunteer rescue teams in the communities. I also oversee the training and placement for search and rescue coordinators in the rescue center here. And then we also deliver training to the fleet. So the Coast Guard has a fairly large fleet of ships that do the coast and the guard.
Mm.
And what we try and do is make sure that those sailors on those ships are able to do search and rescue, as well as environmental response, not just deliver stuff to lighthouses or they do SEAL surveys and science and all kinds of stuff. It's generally an all-purpose shop, but part of my role is to make sure that those folks can do the most, in my opinion, the most important things: save lives and save the environment.
Mm. On the saving life parts, because you mentioned these cruise ship catastrophes earlier, when trying to prevent these cases, or I don't want to misquote it, but I think with the Costa Concordia, wasn't there a drunk captain at play as well?
I don't think he was drunk. I think he definitely made some mistakes, and he got off early. I mean, part of the reason that he was convicted was he fell into a lifeboat at the early stages of the evacuation, and it's part of a captain's role to oversee, the abandonment of the ship. And it's, people will say, oh, it's the captain's role to go down with the ship. That's not true. But it certainly is the captain's responsibility to look after the welfare of his or her crew and passengers. And so when the rescue center actually in Italy got a hold of him, they actually phoned his cell. They said, "Where are you?" And he said, "Oh, I'm supervising from ashore." And they said, "You better get back on that ship because there's still thousands of people on that ship, and they need you there. You need to be organizing." And he didn't, and that was one of the reasons he was convicted. But you can't always rely on the ship to have enough organization, training, capacity, and capability to be able to do it themselves, and that's where that preparation, that regional preparation, comes in.
Mm. Because that's what I wanted to explore a bit more, because humans fail, right? It's just in our nature. We make mistakes. I think when we are panicking, nothing goes as planned. Probably pretty little goes as planned. This is why you probably will not evacuate an A380 within 90 seconds if you landed in water or whatever. How does training work for these circumstances? Because you also have to train your crews to then come on site and handle all that chaos.
Yeah, when you have a stable partner, say for instance, one of the partners we have here in British Columbia is BC Ferries. It's one of the largest ferry companies. I think it is the largest ferry company in the world. But we work with them all the time. So we'll go through scenarios like a ferry having an accident or a fire or needing an evacuation. And we'll do on-water exercises where we'll coordinate with captains. And so we'll get to know each other. They know the people at Rescue Center, and we know how their slides work. And we actually have hovercrafts. We have a couple of hovercrafts that work out of Vancouver, and they can take 150, 200 people at a time. So in those kind of scenarios, we'll work with the partners and do these drills. But the cruise ships are they're international creatures, and they flow in and flow out. Sometimes they're willing to work with us a little bit, and sometimes they're not interested. And so they end up, they're a much bigger problem because, our biggest ferry here has maybe 1,500 people on board. And the cruise ships can sail by with 7,000 people on board. So that's definitely the worrisome part.
Wow. And that brings me to the more personal element of the job. I can only imagine if you're in the situation of distress yourself and you're being rescued, what kind of level of reactions did you see in your life when you actually pulled up to the scene and literally reached out to give somebody the rescuing hand? How do these people come on board and react once they are rescued?
Well, everybody's different. And, I think it's important if you're a recreational boater or even a professional mariner, just to be able to drill and practice. And I think professional mariners have to do it as part of their job. And commercial vessels have to have drills, and they have to have safety equipment, and they have inspectors that come by and that will wave their finger at you if you don't. There isn't necessarily the same kind of pressure for recreational boaters. So my advice to recreational boaters is do some drills, figure out how you get people out of the water if they fall overboard. Make sure that everybody on board the vessel can work the radio and is familiar with calling on VHF 16 and then being able to use the words Mayday or Pan if
what is Pan
if required. So Pan is the next down in urgency from Mayday. It's when the situation is urgent and people are in danger but not necessarily going to die. Mayday is when the vessel itself is in danger of being lost. So if you're sinking or you're on fire, that would be a Mayday. If you're drifting onto the rocks, that will be a Pan.
And what are the most common cases that you see where you think, okay, this could have been prevented?
Well, people run out of gas all the time, which is still annoying. I mean, at least when you run out of gas, it's unlike an airplane. You can drift around for a few hours and we'll find a ride for you. And you know, there are some. The British Columbia coast is a very, very complex coastline, so people make navigational errors all the time. So I would encourage all recreational boaters to take a navigation course, even if they're using electronic navigation. It's not a video game. There's no free med, so you need to be able to learn how to do it properly the first time and not accidentally go over a reef and get yourself into trouble. And so ideally, we'd all like to be out of a job and not have to go to search and rescue cases, but we're far from that now.
If somebody's listening and thinks this sounds like an interesting job to do, what do you think makes a good Coast Guard recruit?
I think someone who's willing to be adventurous and learn. I think those are the important things. And if you love the sea, that's important. But yeah, the Canadian Coast Guard's hiring, and we're looking for folks. So if you have some of the listeners that are Canadian, or even if you're not Canadian and you're a mariner, or especially if you're an engineer, we're short ships engineers right now, and so. If anybody's looking, if they're a maritime engineer and they're looking for a job, then we have a job for you. You can start right away. Start on Monday.
That's good to hear in these times. I want to get into that adventure part again a tiny little bit. Is that something that you personally miss now that you're in a more administrative role, or is even from the bird view that you have on the organization, is it still adventurous?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges change, and so I got, as a side gig, got into the risk assessment piece, which is keeping it interesting. I certainly miss being on the water. I am definitely a boat driver at heart, and a navigator, and being on the water is great. But as you move up the ladder, then part of your job is to not be on the water and to be, looking at budgets and signing paychecks and that kind of stuff, which is not as interesting as adventurous. But it's refreshing to see the new generation of sailors coming on board and getting excited about the mission, and so that keeps me motivated.
And now you've seen the Coast Guard and the surroundings change over time. You've seen new technologies come in. You've seen weather pattern change. What do you wish for the future for the Coast Guard? If you could implement certain things right away, what would those be?
Well, we're fairly far behind in technology. Like, my base, which I'm lucky enough to only be a 10-minute walk away from the base, we don't even have Wi-Fi. So there's definitely some technology wish items on Santa's list. Some better tracking, better marine domain awareness tools would be fabulous. But I think all of those are going to happen now that we've moved over to Department of National Defense. What's happened locally in Canada is our good old American friend Donald Trump has put the thumb on Canada and definitely motivated any political differences to evaporate pretty quickly. And now Canada's moving ahead with a sort of a national urgency on, first of all, NATO spending. So we're going to be, with the Coast Guard's help, the Coast Guard wasn't necessarily completely included in NATO before, but now that it's moved over to Department of National Defense, our entire budget will now be included in NATO. But also, I think the Canadian government is looking at including a security mandate within the Coast Guard's mission. And we're going to be hopefully seeing some more technology, some better sensors, and because we have thousands of properties around Canada on the coastline. We're one of the few countries in the world that still mans lighthouses. So we have 25 lighthouses on the West Coast that are still manned. And, there's opportunities to put sensors and drones and high frequency radar. And so that'll be a lot of fun if we get sort of funding and opportunity to be able to build up that sort of coastal defense and intelligence, surveillance, or reconnaissance. Because the geopolitical world is getting, and I don't have to tell you, it's getting a little bit more threatening.
That's true. And you have some interesting neighbors up there. Quickly on the lighthouse, because I got the chance earlier this year to interview the last lighthouse keeper from a specific lighthouse in Ireland. I still have to edit the episode that it becomes as good as the conversation really was. You mentioned you still have 20 manned lighthouses.
25, I think.
25, actually. Just because for me, I always thought, okay, lighthouses are now here for tourists, basically, and is a thing of the past with all the new navigation systems. Why are lighthouses still so important? Because in the end, they only warn you of danger, right? It should be on your GPS or...
Yeah, with our coast, there's a big difference between the West Coast of Canada and Europe in the fact that you can sail for a full day in British Columbia and not see another human being. And so with the coast being that remote, you need a certain amount of presence at these stations to be able to offer, like, say, for instance, pollution cache or someone to watch over, someone to monitor radios. If we have some of our radio repeaters that are on mountaintop sites that, say, break down or run out of fuel or get an antenna blown over in the wind, the lighthouses can actually activate and go on listening network and help with that mission. They also do real-time weather observations. And their weather observations are of better quality than, say, for instance, a sensor network or even the satellites. So we still use them that way. And I think we're at a point where it's not so much about the lights anymore. It's more about having those forward positions for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. They'll become more strategic as we move forward. So I think the model's changing.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, well then, thank you so much for giving me all these insights into not just the Coast Guard, but search and rescue itself. And maybe as a closing question, are there any particularly, maybe even funny stories that you remember?
Yeah, I definitely, on the ship fire, I felt like Mr. Bean does ship fire. That was kind of me going up and down gangways, waiting for a COVID test. I think that was probably my own comical adventure that maybe I'm not that proud of, but I did manage to get my COVID test in and get into the incident command post, and we actually managed to figure some things out.
I mean, that's a good COVID story to have, I think. It's like, well, everybody else was just hoping to get another beer. You were trying to put a massive fire out. So
in my retirement party, they'll tell me Mr. Sheen. They'll tease me about Mr. Bean doing ship fires.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for the service. Again, I think it's from a very personal perspective, it's crazy that there are people like you out there who are willing to risk their lives to save others in situations of distress, influenced by external events or by lack of preparation. Thanks so much for doing so much on prevention. And I just hope that, no more black swans, and that this episode wasn't jinxing anything. So thank you so much, Tyler.
Yeah, as a sailor, I'm gonna knock on wood here, and hey, thank you very much. I really enjoy the podcast, and I'm almost through all your episodes. So
wow.
I keep cranking them out.
Yeah, maybe good news. We just signed a contract with a editor, so the episodes will only become better. There's going to be more visuals, more sound, so quality is going to increase over the next year.
Excellent.
And this might be the first episode that will be edited with the new one. So
perfect.
Look out for that. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic end of the year with no emergency calls in between, hopefully, for you and everybody out at sea.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Where the ocean meets.